All right, so we are on the three heirs of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire has fallen and new configurations arise. We've already talked about the East Roman Empire, in many ways a genuine continuation of late Roman power, although after the Arab conquests, really a tiny rump of its former self. Then we've talked about the Islamic caliphates, whose power at their maximum extent stretches from the Pyrenees all the way across Iran. And today we're going to talk about the Germanic kingdoms that arise in Western Europe, particularly focusing on the kingdom of the Franks. Now, these Germanic kingdoms arise as the Western Roman Empire just implodes in the 5th century, and various barbarian warbands, oftentimes with the connivance of either pretenders or rogue imperial officials, move into the power vacuum and set up shop. Now, it's important to note, this isn't some kind of massive invasion. You know, I think people envision the fall of Rome involving sort of a horde of barbarians overrunning or flooding everything with, sort of woolly, hairy barbarian bodies. It really couldn't be further from the case. There really aren't that many barbarians in these barbarian kingdoms. In many instances, the largest barbarian kingdom may have no more than maybe 10,000 or 15,000 warriors, obviously larger when you include women and children. But this means that the power of these barbarian kingdoms is actually quite fragile. Barbarian kings need to find a way to sort of maintain the solidarity of their warriors, even as they interact with the societies that they now tenuously dominate. One way that this solidarity is maintained, at least for a while, is through religion. Namely that oftentimes the barbarians try to keep themselves religiously separate from the, at this point, Catholic Romans who they rule over. So all of these barbarian kingdoms initially try to sort of remain somewhat religiously different, either retaining pagan customs. That is the sort of MO of the Franks, who sort of retain their traditional pagan religion. Or some of them are Christian, particularly the Goths. But the Goths are heretical Christians. They are Arian Christians. Remember, we talked about the Arian heresy. Christians who think they're perfectly good Christians, but don't see Jesus as co-equal and co-eternal to God the Father. They see Jesus as a divine figure who was nonetheless created by God the Father and who is in some way inferior in power and precedence. So the Goths are Arian Christians, and these Goths who move into the Visigoths in France, southern France, and Spain, the Ostrogoths in Italy, although they get kicked out by Justinian. They are Arian Christians, and in some ways this is really useful. Imagine, again, you are a sort of a junior, common soldier in one of these barbarian kingdoms. Your name is Wolfar or something like that. You're actually kind of worried when you see that your king or your chief, you notice that he's, playing backgammon with the local bishop. And actually, we know of a Roman bishop named Sidonius, who, when he needs a favor from the local barbarian king, he goes and plays backgammon, makes sure to lose, and that way he gets what he wants. But you see things like this, and you say, gosh, it would be really bad if the king and sort of the upper tier of the warrior aristocracy, if they were simply subsumed or assimilated into Roman society. Because if they get assimilated into the Roman elite, boy, this doesn't bode well to me. That means I would get assimilated into the lower classes. There's sort of religion is therefore a mechanism to keep the whole of barbarian society aloof from the Roman society that it dominates. The Goths, therefore, maintain their Arianism until the late 6th century AD, the Gothic kingdom in Spain. The Franks, who are pagans, they cave a little sooner. Their king Clovis, Clovis the First, Clovis will eventually give us, that will become Louis, and that's where we get, Louis the First through the 16th. But Clovis, the king of the Franks in the early 6th century AD, decides to convert to Catholic Christianity. And I think that the motive must be that even though there is benefit to using sort of your unique religion to maintain solidarity between the king and his barbarian soldiery, I think that is a valuable consideration for a while. Ultimately, kings like Clovis say, at the end of the day, I need the resources of the whole of the society that I rule. And therefore, it is a benefit to have the religion that the rest of your society has. So Clovis has himself baptized. He has all of his warriors also baptized, and therefore the Franks become Catholic. Now, there's a reason that Clovis probably is actually thinking about trying to mobilize the deeper resources of the territory in France that he rules. Because he's actually contemplating a war with the Visigoths who live in southern France. There's a Visigothic kingdom in southern France in addition to a Visigothic kingdom in Spain. Clovis ultimately trounces those Visigoths and annexes that territory into Francia, Franklin, France. The Franks are the French. Franks, France. That's where we get that term. Therefore we see the Franks as Catholics. It's probably for similar reasons that in the late 6th century the Visigoths also convert from Arian Christianity to Catholic Christianity. At the end of the day, they need to connect with the people whom they rule. Now, the dynasty of Clovis is the Merovingian dynasty, which rules over the Franks into the mid-8th century AD. However, as time goes by, the Merovingian kings become increasingly weak. They're reduced to largely ceremonial figures, and real power is held by the mayor of the palace. The most famous and dynamic of these mayors of the palace is Charles Martel. Charles Martel, who serves as a military commander in his own right, who leads a number of successful campaigns in what's now southern France, including the defeat of an Islamic raiding party that is raiding north of the Pyrenees that the Franks successfully attack. You will sometimes see sort of a sort of chauvinistic take that suggests that this battle, saves Western civilization forever. No, probably not. But suffice to say, Charles has a relatively impressive military record, and this sort of gives his son, Pippin, the confidence to, instead of simply succeeding him as mayor of the palace, to actually overthrow the last of the Merovingians and rule as a king in his own right. So thus we have a new line of kings, the Carolingians, named after Pippin's son, Charles. This is Charles the Great, Charlemagne. Now, Charlemagne, who is an aggressive military leader and also a very, very effective administrator, briefly builds up a Frankish state that really is kind of the closest thing that that Europe has seen to a kind of major imperial power since the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Now, a source of Charlemagne's wealth and power is the conquest of pagan peoples who are living on the borders, particularly amongst the Saxons. He engages in a series of aggressive warfare. At times, he behaves with the tremendous brutality, supposedly executing hundreds and maybe even thousands of Saxon prisoners who refuse to convert to Christianity. The Saxons that are living along the Frankish border are still sort of traditional Germanic pagans. But one of the key things that these campaigns produce is slaves. He takes captives by the thousands and funds his operations by essentially selling those slaves into a network of slave traders that largely lead over to the Abbasid Caliphate. Indeed, there's a real synergy between the Abbasids and Charlemagne. The Abbasids need the slaves as human resources, and the Franks need the cash, and so there is essentially a huge flow of Europeans captured in Frankish warfare in large slave trading networks, many of which are actually mediated by the kinds of people we might call Vikings, Scandinavian traders who work their way down the river valleys that flow through Eastern Europe. And then they're selling their slaves to the Abbasids. And the Abbasids have diplomatic contacts with Charlemagne. Indeed, the Caliph gives Charlemagne an elephant, a sort of second-hand elephant. And Charlemagne is very, very pleased to display this elephant as a sign of not only his power, but of his international connections. Charlemagne also extends his power into northern Italy, and in 800 he is crowned imperator, by the Pope himself on Christmas Day in 800. This will eventually become the sort of basis for later claims amongst the kings of Germany to be Holy Roman Emperors. We'll talk more about the creation of the Holy Roman Empire. But this crowning is a sort of precedent, and therefore in the West revives this imperial title, which again had been invented all the way back in past lectures when we talked about Augustus Caesar and his use of the title and name imperator. There is actually a lot of evidence that the Frankish kingdom is overall, there's a sort of surge in economic activity and prosperity. Remember, we talked about the metals, how we can trace mining and smelting by looking at the kind of evidence for pollution in Greenland. While we saw big spikes during the Roman Empire, we actually see a new spike in the time of the Franks, and this seems to be a sign that the economy of Western Europe overall is kind of starting to rev up after what had probably been a significant decline after the fall of the Roman Empire, once you no longer have the imperial state circulating taxes, once you have the economic hit caused by the Justinianic plague. There is a lot of evidence that the economy declined significantly, but it seems to be quite vibrant by the time we get back to the 8th and 9th centuries. Charlemagne, who institutes a whole host of kind of administrative reforms. He himself is interested in reviving learning, both as a patron and also to sort of produce the kind of technocrats that are useful to administer his empire. So he actually hires a Anglo-Saxon monk, Alcuin, to come and set up a school. Some intellectual scholars will describe this as the so-called Carolingian Renaissance, simply because there is a whole kind of flourishing of manuscripts being transcribed, being produced. So the sort of the standards of scholarship and learning also rise under Charlemagne's empire. Now Charlemagne dies in 814 AD. And his empire will actually quickly split up. In 843, it is divided between his three grandsons. There will continue to be a kind of ongoing division of different parts of his empire between his descendants. But essentially, with the death of Charlemagne and the division of his empire, the Carolingians will never be as unified or as powerful. And indeed, one kind of thing that we see, an aspect that we see, is that while there for a while is this kind of coming together, each of Rome's so-called three heirs leading to a kind of brief consolidation, what's notable is that by the time we get to the end of the 9th century, 10th century, things are also kind of falling apart again. The Carolingian Empire has fragmented. The Byzantine Empire, which again in the 6th century looked like it might briefly put the Roman Empire back together, is now a tiny rump of its former self. And the Abbasid Caliphate by the 9th century is in a state of deep decline, to the point that the caliphs will only control a small area around Baghdad itself. And to sort of add to the kind of chaos, we see substantial raiding activity from Scandinavian peoples. These are the Vikings. The Viking is just kind of comes from the Scandinavian word for raider or pirate. These raids hit everywhere from the monasteries along the coasts of Ireland and Scotland and Northumbria. And the Vikings, while they may kind of initially start off as raiding, and we can sort of debate what causes this kind of diaspora of seaborne piracy. Some of it may have to do with traders who had been deeply involved in the slave trade between the Franks and the Abbasids, turning to raiding as the kind of Abbasid market dries up. It's also possible that state formation in Scandinavia, eventually leading to the formation of the Scandinavian kingdoms like Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. But that state formation creates winners and losers, and the losers may be, if you were opposed to the guy who eventually becomes the local king and then the king, maybe one thing you do is turn to raiding. Anyway, there's a period of intense activity. Notably, the Vikings don't just raid. In many instances, raiding may be a kind of preliminary activity towards settlement. So we start to see various Scandinavian settlements in places like northern France, Normandy, in parts of northern England, what becomes called the Danelaw. And some Scandinavians also turn to colonization of largely uninhabited lands, including Scandinavian settlements in Iceland and some very tenuous settlements in Greenland. Indeed, a few hardy Scandinavian explorers will briefly reach the New World and may actually establish a settlement that lasts perhaps for a year or so. So this kind of Scandinavian diaspora on the military situation leads to a great degree of military instability. But what we're going to talk about after our midterm is we're going to talk about how, in some ways, the medieval world around the year 1000 actually seems to be starting to kind of come back together again between the rise of a strong papacy to a degree of stability as we see the formation of kingdoms in Britain, France, and what will become the Holy Roman Empire. So that's what we'll talk about after the midterm.